I said, we'll get started within the next few minutes. If you do miss something, it is all recorded on YouTube, so you can always go back and review. Okay, I think that's enough time for everyone to get here. It's 7:01, 7:02 where I am, so thank you for joining us. My name is Kyle Doyle. I'm the Manager of Asset Management at the Sunshine Coast Regional District. Today we're joined by Shane Walkie, who is the Manager of Utility Services, as well as Director Lee, who is the Area Director for Area A. Before we get started on the presentation today, we will do a quick bit of housekeeping. This presentation is streamed live on both YouTube and Zoom. Those of you on YouTube do not have any options to participate. However, if anything sparks a question or you have a comment, please feel free to email us. The email address will be up at the end of the presentation, but it's info@scrd.ca. If you're on Zoom, there's a few options to participate this evening. At the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button, so you can click on that and type a question. That's probably the best way to ask questions during the presentation. The other way to do it is to raise your hand. You go into the attendees or the participants list and click on your own name and raise your hand. There may be a different way on your screen depending on your operating system or your method of viewing us. So if you raise your hand, I won't be able to see it until the end of the presentation, so just be patient. It shows me, I think it shows me an ordered list of who raised hands, and I invite you to speak and ask your question then. Otherwise, if there's questions in the questions and answers at the end of the presentation, we'll just address those. I'll read them out so everyone on YouTube can hear them. And otherwise, the presentation takes about 20 to 25 minutes, and at the end, we'll take questions. So I'm going to get started, share my screen here. Probably start on the first page. Okay, so today's discussion is about the Sakinaw Ridge Wastewater Treatment Area, and this is a capital funding update coming from this year. If you are within the boundary on the map now, the blue boundary, that would be the Sakinaw Ridge Wastewater Service Area. If you do not own or reside within a property in this area, that's fine. You're welcome to stay and join us. However, tonight's conversation will be limited to this specific service area. If you have another question about another service area, please email me. But otherwise, let's discuss this one. Tonight we're going to quickly do a review of our previous discussions and engagement, and then we'll get up to date on where we're at with the capital funding. We'll talk about what's coming up next, and we'll take some questions at the end. So before we got here tonight, we did a wastewater service review started in 2019. and that was a high-level review of all wastewater services within the Sunshine Coast Regional District. That was followed up by the development of asset management plans for each individual wastewater service. These were a collection of all the relevant information, bylaws, and inventory of the assets, as well as some preliminary life cycle and operational cost analysis. We presented these to the board in November of 2019, and then we went out to share it with the community and gather some feedback from the residents that were affected by this information. During that process, we created some fact sheets to help present the information and show what preliminary cost information we were finding. From those presentations, we gathered feedback and went back to the board with a revised budget, and that resulted in some user rates and frontage fees across the systems being adjusted to reflect the updated budget information. Some of the key findings of the 2019 wastewater service review. The primary thing we discovered is that the existing revenue was unsustainable. That meant that operation budgets were often greater than the revenues generated from user fees, which led to reserve contributions being deferred frequently. We also found that most wastewater systems did not plan for future capital expenditures, and that the ratio of capital reserves to future capital expenses was far too low. So a recap for those of you who were with us in the engagement sessions in the winter, you may have seen this before, but previously the funding model for wastewater services looked something like this. From every parcel within the wastewater service, developed or not, we collected a frontage fee. And then from every parcel that had a home on it or was connected to the wastewater service in some manner, we collected a user fee. These two fees were put together to form the operating budget, which was then used to fund annual expenditure, capital reserves, and operating reserves. So coming out of the previous review, some of the outcomes we had, we decoupled that user fee and frontage fee, and so they're not used to combine to one pot anymore. Now the user fee revenues only fund operations and maintenance expenses, and frontage fees only fund capital expenses. Through an extensive review of our operations and maintenance requirements, which included a pretty extensive audit of operations and maintenance activities, we came up with a revised budget to ensure adequate funding, and we also established minimum reserve targets for operations and maintenance to make sure the money was there when we needed it, and that'll be explained in a second. This is a process that we continue to review annually to make sure that we're pretty accurate in what we projected our expenses will be. So we also developed a capital funding model to help us plan for future capital expenses. As we said earlier, that's not being planned for prior to that. So our new funding model that we have now looks like what's on the screen now, and that is user fees, fund operation and maintenance budget, and operations and maintenance reserve, and frontage fees fund the capital expenditures and the capital reserve. And you can see this is a lot more easy to understand and transparent, and it helps with our accounting, and it's beneficial on a lot of levels. So a common question we would get out of the engagement session from every single service area is, why do we need an operating reserve? Due to the nature of the framework in which local governments, especially regional districts, operate, we're not able to borrow for operational expenses, and obviously unforeseen expenses can exceed the annual operating budget, so it's important to have the money on hand so we're able to do the work that we need to do. Operating reserves are only withdrawn for your service area, and they're not shared within your other wastewater service areas or for other services on the Sunshine Coast. So coming out of last year's review, there was an impact on the wastewater rates for Sakinaw Ridge. We saw an increase in the operations and maintenance budget by 42% based on our review of historical operations and maintenance activities, and looking at what was required to be able to get the effluent quality we are on our licenses. And that means your user fees increased from $718.75 to $955.94. There's also a negligible reserve for Sakinaw at this time, because for the most part, frontage fees subsidized the operations and maintenance budget in the past. And so we introduced an operation and maintenance reserve contribution levy for the next 5 years so that we can establish a minimum reserve. Frontage fees were left untouched last year, and the total increase from year over year was $487.19. So we got a lot of feedback, and we think we listened to it fairly well as best as we could for now, and we'll continue to try to listen to feedback as we go forward. But one of the things we heard is we were being too conservative with our estimates, and so we went back and really dug through SCRD contract data to refine our long-term capital model. We found we were able to reduce our engineering allowances by 3%, and we were able to reduce our contingency estimates by 15%. Residents also kind of communicated to us that they had a higher tolerance for debt than we expected. And so where possible that was made sense for the system, we looked at financing larger portions of projects in the future. And then the last thing we heard quite often was there's some anxiety and uncertainty around the future rate structures and how these may increase. And for that reason, we're looking to propose a 5-year rate structure for the board to consider, and this would create some rate certainty in the near term for both residents and staff. So we also updated our savings and borrowing rates, and that's something we'll do obviously on an annual basis to make sure we're matching the most current information. But on top of that, we introduced a variable borrowing rate, which means if we anticipate a shorter term loan or a longer term loan, there's a corresponding rate that we use to predict how much the cost of borrowing would be. And then just to refine our inflationary cost, because we're using current estimates and inflating them to future values. Instead of using a flat rate across time, we found we're able to do a variable construction cost index, which minimized the inflation where possible. And those two things helped reduce our estimates from our preliminary estimates quite a significant amount. And again, this might be a review for anyone who joined us in the previous engagement sessions, and otherwise it might fill in some gaps in the context, but as I was saying earlier, the regional district operates within a framework that's established by the BC government, and basically a lot of what we can do is laid out in the Local Government Act. And one of the primary confining factors in funding small services and services in regional districts is that service areas can only be funded by the participants within the service area. And that means the costs are shared by a large number of people, or sorry, a small number of people, depending on the service. But we're not able to, like Sea Shelter or municipality is able to collect taxes from everyone and then benefit a small area as they choose, whereas a regional district, especially for wastewater services and these discrete service areas, isn't able to do that. Another thing to recognize is all infrastructure degrades over time. You can use your house as an analogy, but as things get older, they have reduced performance and they have higher maintenance costs. And then also, we can expect infrastructure costs to inflate over time, and if you've been in construction for some time, that's pretty obvious, but some people aren't always aware of how significant that can impact future costs. So just a broad overview of how we made our capital models before I get into them. We developed a timeline of anticipated replacement using the estimated useful life of the infrastructure, and that was taken from engineering best practices and estimates based on our experience with infrastructure. And then where possible, we used the most recent replacement costs. We inflated those values to future values using the construction cost index. And then where we anticipated borrowing for projects, we included debt financing costs. And on the flip side of the ledger, if we anticipated a reserve would be bolstered or our savings would be accrued, we applied an annual interest accrual rate. Just want to highlight that if we had a similar system, we would use a more recent replacement cost than old costs to reduce the inflationary effect. And a refresher for everyone, your wastewater system generally is composed of 3 components: treatment plant, a disposal system, and a collection system. And each of those has a different but fairly long useful life. So we expect treatment plants will generally last 50 years, disposal systems generally last 40 years, and collection systems generally last 80 years. And so when you think about that time frame, it's important that we have a fairly large consideration in our capital plan for how long we should be planning ahead, or else we could just not be planning for anything and then be surprised when it enters the horizon of our study. Sakinaw Ridge is one of the newest wastewater systems on the Sunshine Coast, and there are advantages and disadvantages of that. Some of the advantages are that we are looking at a fair amount of time before we're anticipating major infrastructure renewal. So if we look at the next 30 years, we can see that we have a pump for our drain field and our drain field that we'll have to look at replacing. And Sakinaw Ridge has experienced a few user rate increases over time, and it's actually one of the highest historical increases. It's $43.38 a year of increases since we took over. That hasn't been applied every year, but that's just the average. So generally with these presentations, we show what would happen if we just followed the historical average, and it's normally pretty enlightening because that number is closer to $2, and it's not a very positive situation. In your case, if we just continued with $43.38 a year, we would have a reserve balance that looked quite healthy over the next 30 years, and we would see our frontage fees increase quite rapidly. And that's a little bit too high. We don't think that it's necessary to increase our rate at that rate. I'm just showing how it would look if we continue on the path we're on. So it's important that we chart a clear path forward so we don't have unnecessary increases. So again, this is what your, if we just had a historical increase of the existing frontage fee over the next 30 years, we'd go from $418 today to $1,720 in 2050. And under that scenario, again, if we look at the next 50 years, we start capturing a few more big items. We have your collection system, your treatment plant, and those other two items, as I said. And the historical frontage fee, it gets to the point where we've collected so much money that it's not necessary to continue collecting at such a high rate. And so we'd like to look at a little different system here. There are a lot of costs outside the 50-year horizon that we're anticipating being quite large, and a lot of that's the collection system. There's some pressurized components of the collection system, and it's difficult construction in the terrain. So when we look at the long-term inflation effects combined with those factors, the expenses become quite a bit. But at this time, we're looking at a 50-year horizon, and that avoids too much inflationary effect on the future prediction of our prices. So again, this is one of the proposals we have for the capital funding for Sakinaw Ridge. Starting over the next 4 years, we have $100 increases every year, and then we increase by 2% each year beyond that. And so this is the 50-year capital plan, and for today it was $418 a year in frontage fees, and it would go up to $834 in 5 years, and then go up to $1,994 by the end of the study. And in this system, we project that we'll have a sufficient reserve to fund the next two replacements on hand, and then a minor amount of borrowing associated with the treatment plant in 2057, and then borrowing again for the collection system. But this seems like a fairly stable and definitely a sustainable financial plan. So it looks good. And from a capital side, I must say Sakinaw Ridge is again, it's in a good position because we have time to build reserves for the larger expenses. So the second plan we're looking at today is a little bit more of a rapid increase for a shorter amount of time. So instead of going up to about $800, we increase by $175 a year for the next 3 years, and 2% from there. And we see a similar result with the reserve balance, where it's pretty sufficient for the next two items. It's looking at about 75% of the treatment plant, and then we still have reserve, and we're borrowing a small amount here. But you're not seeing what you see often in these models is when we borrow money, the frontage fee is not sufficient to pay for the anticipated debt, and so there'll be a jump when there's a infrastructure replacement, and you don't see that in the Sakinaw plan, which is a good sign. And the third option we're looking at here, and it's kind of just 3 different ways to increase to where we need to be before getting to a 2% annual increase. You may be asking yourself, why are we targeting a 2% annual increase? And the answer to that is it reflects CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. Basically, the concept would be that if we increase the rate by 2% a year, the equivalent buying power would be the same. So $100 in 2020 is $102 theoretically in 2021, and such forth. So that's why we're looking at a 2% annual increase. That is considered a equivalent taxation for all parcel owners through the study period. So again, in this scenario, we look at raising it $50 a year for the next 10 years. and then a 2% annual increase from there. So this is sufficient. This is a fine plan for the financial sustainability of this system. So any of these three plans would work, and I think my recommendation would probably be the more gradual one to relieve the pressure on other financial aspects of the system, because there are some issues that aren't capital related, but I will discuss them briefly today just so everyone's aware. So this is a comparison of those four fee structures we spoke about. The yellow one that gets it quite a bit higher is the historical one, because it's a little bit slower increase than the annual plans, but it continues to increase at almost $50 a month. And then the other three are quite similar, and you can see they track almost all the same and at pretty much the same place. So that's basically a function of this being such a new system. So as I was saying, we're looking at a 5-year rate structure, and that's just to provide some rate certainty, and I will illustrate that what that means in numbers here. And when we talk about a 5-year rate structure, and I show all these 50-year plans, this is the study we're looking at, is just the next 5 years. So it's not, we're not asking for a commitment to a 50-year plan, but we are asking for the expectation is that we start going towards a path of sustainable financing for all our wastewater systems. So here's the Sakinaw Ridge frontage fee schedule. And we'll start with user fees. You can see it increases over the next 4 years. And what's happening here is we have a build out rate. There's 8 parcels that are built out, and that might have changed this year, but as of when this information was taken from the end of the year, there's 8 parcels built out of 29. And when we look at an ideal system, users pay for the operations and maintenance costs. But for the Sakinaw Ridge system, the operations and maintenance costs are for a system that is not near capacity. And unfortunately, for what much of wastewater treatment's costs, the volume being treated doesn't have a massive impact on the cost of the treatment. And so historically, frontage fees have subsidized the operations costs to a great extent. And when we separate those two, if we had just put all the costs on the users immediately, it would have been a very, very significant jump. And this is still something that we're struggling to come up with something that's equitable, because it isn't built out fully, and it would become quite an expensive cost. And so there's consideration being given and discussion that will be presented to the board, where we talk about having the parcels that are not occupied subsidize the cost of operation. So in this scenario in front of you, that is not being considered, but it will be shown in a second. User fees are expected to escalate, and a balanced user fee for this number of users is $1,690.96 in 2023. We have an operations and maintenance reserve contribution. You can see that it ends after 5 years. And then you can see the 3 plans we discussed. In bold would be the frontage fee, and then the total number is the summation of the user fee, the operations and maintenance reserve contribution, and the frontage fee. And it comes from $1,386.75 this year, and it increases depending on which plan you want to somewhere in the $2,500 range. So as I was saying, the annual operating budget at this point is estimated to be $27,000 for this plant. And with 8 users, if it was divided equally between them, it would be $3,385 per user, and that is exorbitant. As we get farther into build out, you can see that fee comes down quite a bit. This is something that will be reviewed to make sure that our estimate wasn't too high, but without having a sufficient reserve budget, we couldn't be anything but conservative when we're anticipating our operating budget for this system. So when we talk about operational funding, you can see what I've done here is I've taken the schedule of user fees that was on the 5-year rate structure, and I'm showing the per user shortfall compared to what the actual cost of operating it is for 8 users. And then in the far right column would be what the parcel tax supplement would be required to make up that shortfall. So basically, each user would be paying $718.75 this year. If the entire operation budget was on the users, they would have to pay an additional $2,666.88. But instead, what we've done is we're using the parcel tax to offset that, and there's a $735 for every single parcel supplement required to make up that shortfall. And that's where we are at here, and this is what will be, something like this will be what will be presented to the board once we refine these numbers and make sure we're accurate with the current state of the system. We're looking at a user fee, an operation and maintenance reserve contribution for a short time, a parcel tax supplement to compensate the low build-out percentage in this system, and then a frontage fee to pay for the capital reserves. The uncolored items on the left are the operation costs, and the colored items represent the capital costs associated with the system. And that's where we're at now. So going forward, I don't talk this much normally, I apologize. Going forward, we're going to finalize our capital funding model. We're going to pursue grant opportunities wherever we can. We're going to present the 5-year rate structure to the board for consideration, and we'll continue to do an annual review of the operations and maintenance budget. Sakinaw Ridge is one of the systems that we'll continue to work on to make sure we can dial this in. And in conclusion, we have current rates are not financially sustainable. There are multiple ways to finance 50-year capital expenditures, and because Sakinaw Ridge is new, our capital side is fairly flexible and looking good. An annual review will maintain the updated information, and for Sakinaw specifically, a low build-out percentage does create some equity issues with the system we've put forward. So if you have any questions, please feel free to check out the website for this wastewater service, which is www.scrd.ca/Sakinaw Ridge, or the wastewater website, which is scrd.ca/wastewater, or send me an email, info@scrd.ca, and I can help you understand what's going on here. I'll leave that up for a few seconds in case anyone needs to take notes, and then we can get to the questions if we have any. Okay. So we have a question here from the Alliston and McCrae families, and it says, I'm just going to click on this button. Sorry. I appreciate the concept of user pay. However, I would suggest we receive less than many areas of the coast regarding streetlights, garbage pickup, etc. Is this considered by the board? So the user fees that we talk about are related only to wastewater, and they're just for the wastewater specifically. I'm not exactly sure where the services that we provide otherwise. I know that in Roberts Creek there's a new green waste bin and that sort of thing, and that's billed separately on your tax bill. So I think that when it comes to services and who delivers them, I do believe that all service levels are considered by the board when they consider taxation. And if Director Lee wants to answer that further, he can, or you can send me an email and we can look into it more in detail to see how your breakdown works specifically for you on those other aspects. And I just want to say, I know it's Friday night, and some people may not be able to attend or may not have the energy to get into the questions right now. So I do encourage you to email us, and it might not be as fast and as immediate, but we can get an answer to you of any questions you have, whether you're watching this on YouTube in a week or so, or even beyond that. We're happy to engage on this and make sure everyone feels informed. two questions have come in. I'm not sure if you guys can see them, but I'll read them anyways. How can we convey our support that operational expenses be shared with non-occupied lots? I think with any decisions that have to do with local government or any level of government, you should contact your representative, and you can email me as well, and I can pass it on. But you know, your voices are important, and communicating that their sentiment that you feel is very important. So info at SCRD is one way, and I can direct you to whoever is supposed to collect your thoughts. So feel free to do it that way. I think that would be the best way to convey your opinions, your support, or your dismay either way. And then DK asks, or comments, there's a lot of info we would like to review. So this presentation is on YouTube, and the link to that is on the Sakinaw Ridge website. And I'm also, I've had to do, this is number 14 out of 15 of these presentations, and I haven't had a chance to just fact check and preview before I put them in PDFs, because I know I've made a few small typos here and there, and so I will be going through those in the next little bit. I'm hoping by end of next week these will all be up on the websites in PDF forms, so you can go through the slides one at a time and look at them in detail and take screenshots or whatever you want. But for now, feel free to look at the YouTube video and push pause where you want to if you have any specifics you'd like to see. And also you can email me if I haven't got it out by next week, and I will get you a copy specifically. And I fully appreciate that. It is a lot of information, and it's a lot to process all at once. I've been immersed in this for over a year now, and so sometimes I say things very quickly that I assume are common understanding, and it's not. So I appreciate that. So normally what I do is, if there's a lull in questions for about 5 minutes, I will shut down the YouTube, and then I'll turn off the Zoom and say goodnight. Well, say goodnight, then turn off everything. So no rush. I understand it takes time to questions and put things forward, but if in the next 5 minutes no one answers questions, I'll be ending this session for now. Five minutes always feels like a lot longer. Um, when you're sitting in a room quietly by yourself. Okay, I think I'm going to end the YouTube now. So if you're on YouTube, thank you for joining us and have a good evening. I look forward to questions in the email.